U.S. Marines love to be fuck. U.S. Marines love huge hard cocks. Fucking. Wild, young range cowboys. Fucking U.S. Marines, legs in the air, butt holes deeper. Yeah, U.S. Marines, drink all that cum, boy. Come flowing. Yeah, U.S. Marines, you love to be butt huge cocks. Fucking you boys. Wild young range cowboys. Fucking U.S. Marines buttholes. Deeper. Yeah, U.S. Marines swallow like cum. You love swallowing cum. Come low. Yes, swallow like cum. Huge cocks. Fucking you boys.
Fuck me deeper. Deeper. Come on. Yeah.
Yeah, 28 U.S. Marines pulling up in black Ford Raptor trucks. Helicopters landed. Ram Ranch is under siege, under lockdown. U.S. Marines are gonna fuck Ram Ranch cowboy butts. Looking for Prince Harry, gonna fuck Prince Harry's butt. Yeah, wild, buff, cool U.S. Marines, gonna fuck cowboy butts. Yeah, 28 U.S. Marines pulling up in black Ford Raptor trucks. Helicopters landed. Ram Ranch is under siege, under lockdown. U.S. Marines are gonna fuck Ram Ranch cowboy butts. Looking for Prince Harry, gonna fuck Prince Harry's butt. Yeah, wild, buff, cool U.S. Marines, gonna fuck cowboy butts. Yeah, 28 U.S. Marines pulling up in black Ford Raptor trucks. Helicopters landed. Ram Ranch is under siege, under lockdown. U.S. Marines are gonna fuck Ram Ranch cowboy butts. Looking for Prince Harry, gonna fuck Prince Harry's butt. Yeah, wild, buff, cool U.S. Marines, gonna fuck cowboy butts. Yeah, Big Mantis and Cobra, leader of the pack, Matt the Whopper and Andrew and Connor, huge hard cocks, hard as rocks, gonna fuck the wild young Ram Ranch cowboy butts. Yeah, Brennan, Long Dick Brennan, gonna fuck those boys. Trevor and Greg and Justin, gonna fuck you some buttholes. Deep. Yeah, U.S. Marines, got your cowboys stripped naked up against the wall. Fucking those boys. Yeah, Big Mantis and Cobra.